The audience expected a light conversation about films and legacy, but within seconds, the mood in the studio shifted. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward slightly, looking at Al Pacino with a curious expression. "So you're saying Hollywood hasn't really changed at all?" Al Pacino didn't hesitate. "No," he said plainly. "Not really." The audience reacted immediately with a mix of surprised laughter and murmurs. Quick heads up, subscribe to Backstory Uncovered, because what starts as a normal conversation here is about to take a turn no one expected. Just moments earlier, the atmosphere had been relaxed. Al Pacino had walked out to warm applause, waving politely to the audience before taking his seat across from Whoopi Goldberg. The conversation started exactly how most interviews with legendary actors do. Stories about his long career, reflections on classic films, and the challenges of staying passionate about acting after decades in the industry. Whoopi smiled as she flipped through her notes. "You've worked in this business for over 50 years, she said. "Most people watching probably think Hollywood has evolved a lot since you first started." Pacino leaned back slightly in his chair. "It's evolved technically," he said. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. "But..." Pacino gave a small shrug. "The people running things, not so much." The audience murmured again. Whoopi let out a short laugh. "That's a pretty blunt answer." Pacino smiled faintly. "I've reached the age where blunt answers are easier." The audience laughed loudly. Whoopi nodded. "Fair enough." But she leaned forward again, clearly interested now. "When you say the people running things haven't changed, what do you mean by that exactly?" Pacino paused for a moment. "You want the honest answer?" Whoopi smiled. "That's usually why we ask." The audience chuckled. Pacino nodded slowly. "All right." He leaned forward slightly. "The same power structures that existed when I was a young actor, they're still there." The room grew quieter. Whoopi crossed her arms slightly. "But the industry talks constantly about progress." Pacino tilted his head. Talking about progress and actually changing things are two different conversations. The audience reacted with a mix of applause and murmurs. Whoopi noticed the reaction and looked back at him. "So you think it's mostly talk?" Pacino shrugged again. "Sometimes it feels that way." Whoopi tapped her pen lightly on the desk. "That's interesting, because a lot of younger actors say Hollywood is more open now than ever before." Pacino nodded. "I'm sure it feels that way to them." Whoopi leaned forward again. "But you don't agree?" Pacino paused before answering. "I think the surface changes faster than the system." The audience let out a collective, "Oh." Whoopi smiled slightly. "That sounds like something you've been thinking about for a while." Pacino chuckled softly. "When you've been around long enough, you notice patterns." Whoopi tilted her head. "So what patterns are you seeing?" Pacino looked directly at her. "The same people deciding which stories get told." A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Whoopi didn't interrupt. Pacino continued calmly. "And the same people deciding which voices matter." The audience murmured again. Whoopi leaned back slightly. "That's a strong statement." Pacino nodded. "But it's not a new one." Whoopi glanced toward the audience briefly before turning back to him. "Some people would say the industry has made real efforts to change that." Pacino gave a thoughtful look. "I think people want change." Whoopi waited. "But wanting something," Pacino added, "and giving up power are two very different things." The audience gasped softly. Whoopi laughed under her breath. "You're not holding anything back today." Pacino smiled again. "You asked." The audience applauded loudly. But Whoopi wasn't finished. She leaned forward again, this time with a more serious tone. "Let me ask you something honestly." Pacino nodded. "Go ahead." Whoopi looked straight at him. "Do you think actors like you helped create that system?" The audience suddenly went quiet again. Pacino didn't answer immediately. He stared at the desk for a moment, clearly considering the question carefully. Whoopi waited. "So," she said after a pause, "were you part of the problem?" The tension in the studio rose instantly. Pacino slowly looked back up at her. And when he finally spoke, His voice was calm, but unmistakably direct. "Oh, absolutely." The audience gasped. Whoopi blinked in surprise. Pacino leaned slightly forward in his chair. "And that's exactly why I can recognize it." The room erupted with reactions as the conversation suddenly became far more intense than anyone had expected. The audience reaction hadn't fully settled after Al Pacino's blunt admission. A few people were still murmuring, some clapping, others just staring in surprise. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair for a moment, clearly processing what he had just said. "Okay," she said slowly. "I didn't expect you to answer that so directly." Pacino gave a small smile. "Well, you asked a direct question." The audience laughed softly, easing the tension for a second. But Whoopi leaned forward again. "So when you say you were part of the system," she continued, "what exactly do you mean?" Pacino rested his hands together on the table. "I mean when you're young and suddenly successful in this industry, you don't question much." The audience listened closely. "You're grateful," he continued. "You're excited. Doors open. People say yes to you. And you don't always stop to ask who those doors stay closed for." Whoopi nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer." Pacino shrugged slightly. "It's the truth." A few audience members clapped. Whoopi tapped her pen lightly on the desk again. But critics would say actors with power could have pushed for change earlier. Pacino nodded without hesitation. "That's fair." The audience reacted with another murmur. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. "You're agreeing with the critics now?" Pacino chuckled softly. "I've learned something over the years." Whoopi smiled slightly. "What's that?" Pacino leaned forward a little. "That defending the system just because it benefited you, that's not wisdom." The audience applauded louder this time. Whoopi let the applause settle before speaking again. "So do you think things are improving now?" Pacino paused, considering the question. "Yes," he said eventually. Whoopi tilted her head. "But earlier you said the system hasn't really changed." Pacino nodded. "It hasn't changed enough." The audience murmured again. Whoopi leaned forward, clearly curious. "So what would real change look like to you?" Pacino smiled faintly. "Different people making decisions." Whoopi waited. "Not just actors on screen," he added, "but writers, producers, executives, the people behind the cameras." A few audience members clapped again. Whoopi nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually a conversation a lot of people in Hollywood are having right now." Pacino gave a small shrug. "Good." Whoopi smiled. "You sound cautiously optimistic." Pacino laughed quietly. "That's about as optimistic as I get." The audience laughed with him. For a moment the tension seemed to ease. But Whoopi looked at him again, curious. "Let me ask you something else," she said. Pacino nodded. "You've been famous for decades," Whoopi continued. "You've seen Hollywood from every angle." She leaned slightly closer. "If you were starting your career today, would you still choose this industry?" The audience leaned in again. Pacino thought about the question longer this time. Finally, he nodded. "Yes." Whoopi smiled. "That was fast." Pacino looked out toward the audience. "Because despite all its flaws, storytelling still matters." The audience clapped warmly. Pacino continued. "Movies, television, theater, they help people understand each other. And when storytelling is honest, it can challenge the system we just talked about." Whoopi nodded slowly. "That's a pretty powerful reason." Pacino smiled. "It's the only reason I stayed." The audience applauded again, louder now. Whoopi turned slightly toward the crowd. "Well, I think it's safe to say we got a very honest conversation today." Pacino chuckled softly. "You did ask for honesty." Whoopi laughed. "That I did." She then turned toward the camera as the applause continued. "And now we want to hear from you watching at home." Pacino looked toward the camera as well. "Do you agree with what Al said about Hollywood?" Whoopi asked. She gestured slightly toward him. "Or do you think the industry has changed more than he believes?" Pacino gave a small grin. I'm curious to hear that myself. Whoopi smiled. So share your thoughts in the comments. She pointed toward the camera. And don't forget to subscribe to Backstory Uncovered for more conversations like this. The audience applauded one more time as the cameras slowly pulled back. But even as the segment wrapped up, it was clear one thing had surprised everyone in the room. After decades in Hollywood, Alabama Pacino hadn't come to defend the system. He came to be honest about it.